Hello and welcome to our commentary on The Chosen. I'm Dr. Scott Hefelfinger, joined here by Dr. Michael Barber, my colleague here at the Graduate School of Theology, and my good friend. So we are beginning to offer some thoughts on Season 2 of The Chosen, beginning here with Episode 1, which has the title Thunder. Before we kind of launch into that, I just wanted to explain, if you haven't seen our introduction to this commentary, go ahead and take a look at that. It kind of gives you a sense of what we're trying to do, how we're approaching this, the attitudes that we're taking, the goals, especially of returning to Scripture and appreciating Scripture more. So do take a look at that if you haven't seen our introduction. And then also, I just want to kind of cue us back to a couple of scenes in Season 1 that set us up here in Season 2, and especially for the things that we want to talk about in this episode. You know, after living with these characters for a while, we commented on things that we're liking, things that we're questioning, some highlights, some lower points. And Season 1 begins with Jesus's encounter with Mary Magdalene. This is the first moment we see Jesus. And one of the things that we appreciated there was seeing the divinity of Christ, the transcendent dimension of Christ, sometimes called a higher Christology, that he knows things that no one else could know, and we see clearly that he is God through that. There's a kind of power and authority that he has. We really liked that, and in the very next episode, we kind of questioned that maybe this was falling out of view, and so we've kind of been watching this, is Jesus presented in a overly ordinary, overly kind of meek, maybe weak way, or is that divine transcendence peeking through? And it's a delicate balance, and so we just want to kind of keep our eyes on that. At the end of Season 1, we have the woman at the well, and they're in Samaria, and that scene is important because there again we see this divine transcendence. Jesus tells her past life in a beautiful and moving way. But then also it sets us up, they're in Samaria, they're going to be spending some time there, and that's where we kind of pick up here in Season 2, Episode 1 called Thunder. And we pick up there as they're spending some time in Samaria.
This episode's a lot of fun because it focuses on one apostle in particular, and that would be John, the son of Zebedee. And so the title of the episode is a reference to something we actually see in the gospel narratives. We see Jesus give two of his disciples nicknames, or I guess one nickname. In Mark chapter 3, we have the list of the apostles, and there we read about James, and we can go to the slide here, James the son of Zebedee, and John the brother of James, to whom he gave the name Boanerges, that is, sons of thunder. And so this episode is going to play a little bit with that tradition that we see here in the Gospel of Mark. How did they get that name? Mark never actually tells us how they got that name, although there is an episode in the Gospel of Luke that many people have seen as relevant here. We find that story in Luke chapter 9. And so let's take a look at that and go back to the slides here. We read, Jesus sent messengers before him, and they went and entered a village of the Samaritans to prepare him. But they did not receive him because his face was set to go to Jerusalem. So why did they oppose Jesus? Because they recognized he was on his way to Jerusalem, and there's a lot of hostility, as you probably know, between Jews and Samaritans. When the disciples James and John saw this, they said, "Lord, do you want us to call down fire from heaven to consume them?" But he turned and rebuked them, and then they went to another village. Now, here we have James and John being identified as rather fiery individuals, right? They really want to see the Samaritans become the victim of divine wrath.
That's right. And we see this portrayed in this episode.
Right.
And this is linked to the giving of the name. And we have this in a clip. So why don't we take a look at that?
Yeah. You wanted to use the power of God to bring down fire, to burn these people up?
Well, it sounds a lot worse when you say it that way.
You too. You're like a storm on the sea.
Come on.
Thunder exploding out of your chests at every turn. In fact, That's what I'm going to call you from now on. James and John, the sons of thunder.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Today, it was not good. But strong passion can be a good thing when channeled for righteousness. I just may have to delay giving you that authority we discussed earlier, or in smaller doses, until you two calm down a bit.
So here we see part of the challenge the producers of The Chosen face, and that is, how do you integrate the different gospel accounts? Of course, in Mark's gospel, Jesus refers to James and John as sons of thunder, but there is no reference to the fact that James and John wanted to call down fire from heaven on Samaritans. In Luke's gospel, we have the latter story, but
Right.
if that was meant to help us understand why they're called sons of thunder, why doesn't Luke tell us that that was their nickname? So the producers here are trying to bring together things in light of different, and there's some humor here. I do appreciate that. I do appreciate the need for humor. I also recognize the challenge of trying to integrate these different gospel narratives. Of course, in The Chosen, Jesus is at Sychar, a Samaritan city. He's there for a while. Of course, in the Gospel of Luke, he doesn't stay with the Samaritans. In the Gospel of John, Jesus does stay with Samaritans, but he's only there for a couple of days, where in The Chosen, you get the sense he's there for a much longer period of time. And so the book of Acts actually is really interesting, because the book of Acts tells us that after the resurrection, they had to send James and John to evangelize the Samaritans who haven't really heard the gospel yet. So I'm curious if The Chosen portrays the book of Acts, if they're going to take account of that, how they're going to weave that together. Then in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says, don't go into any Samaritan towns. So we see some differences here among the Gospels, and I know it's challenging when you're doing something like The Chosen to pull it all together, but it's always helpful to go back to the text and say, okay, what is actually in the show and what's in Scripture? So I thought I'd highlight some of that here.
Yeah, and then once you see these different scriptural portraits that we have, and you think about the decisions that the producers of The Chosen have to make, you can get a sense of maybe why they're weaving things together in the way that they are. And so thinking about this episode, I was kind of reflecting on some of these, potential discrepancies, and, why do they give Jesus this particular time and maybe even elongated period of time in Samaria? And I think it ties into the emphasis maybe that they're placing on faith. There's a kind of, one of the little backstories in this episode is that Photina, who is the woman at the well, has sort of told everybody about Jesus, sometimes more than once, and she's just so excited, and they've believed her story. And they've done that without seeing miracles. And so Jesus is emphasizing and highlighting the faith that he finds in Samaria. And I think there's a kind of implied contrast with how in other areas, especially in Jewish territories, sometimes there are miracles that are not accompanied by belief. And so lifting up this emphasis on faith, I think, makes sense here. And then there's another story that I want to return to as we go along, but there's a fascinating way that the parable of the Good Samaritan is sort of woven background, foreground of this episode. And it raises some interesting questions, and also there's some beautiful dimensions to it. We'll come back to that. But I think, some of these things are kind of working together when they're deciding, okay, we have a kind of patchwork thing here of Samaria, Jesus' time there, his approach to it in the Gospels and Acts. How are we going to weave that together in a way that...
And you see how, of course, the gospel writers themselves are, when you see these things brought together in The Chosen, I think it's helpful to go back to the Gospels themselves, and then you see the different emphases in the different gospel writers, which are not necessarily contradictory. And I think The Chosen does do a good job of showing, well, actually, some of these things can work together. We've seen instances of that here throughout the show. One of the things that I especially like about this show is, of course, you get the emphasis on thunder. John is the son of thunder, not just because he wants to call down fire from heaven, but also because he's passionate. And that is really drawn out in the way, in the opening scene, they depict John, now the apostle, writing the gospel, and he's interviewing the various people who were eyewitnesses to Jesus's ministry in the wake of the death of his brother James, who has now passed away. So that episode, the death of James, the martyrdom of James, is actually recorded in the book of Acts, Acts chapter 12. So this is probably somewhere in the 40s or so. And so we're getting now a fast forward, if you will, right? We're looking at the apostles after Jesus' ministry. And we actually see in the book of Acts that story related in Acts chapter 12. We can go to the slide here, Acts chapter 12, 1 through 3. About that time, King Herod laid violent hands upon some who belonged to the church. He had James, the brother of John, killed with the sword. After he saw that it pleased the Judeans, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. So there is a outpouring of persecution. There's a new phase in the apostles' ministry launched in chapter 12, where now the apostles are really under the threat of death. And that's where the gospel of John, or at least the origins of the gospel of John, is being placed here in the Chosen. John is now, in the wake of all of this, thinking about the need to write down what other people have seen and record it in a book. And we've got a clip here.
Yeah,
let's go to the clip. Yeah.
My son, why are you doing all this? Why now?
Because we're getting older. And our memories are...
I mean, why now? During Shiva.
Because everyone is here. I need to get their memories.
You need to mourn Big James.
He won't be the last of us this happens to. Who knows when I will see the others again, or if. I'm not in a hurry to write a whole book, but I do want to get the eyewitness stories now, while we're together.
So John has, been interviewing a number of the apostles, and also Mary Magdalene is there, and our Blessed Mother is portrayed there. And so each of them has something to contribute. And I think this goes to the point you were making earlier, Michael, about how the composition of the Gospels is not something that is meant to be sort of photorealistic, but they work with different sources. They're targeting different audiences. They have different kind of theological motifs or themes that they want to emphasize. And so when we talk about the challenge of bringing together these differing views, it's actually kind of neat that this episode opens with sort of why we even have that challenge, the compilation of sources and the crafting.
And the
gospel.
evangelists are different from one another just in terms of their personality and their interests as well. And that gets brought out a little bit too with John and Matthew here. So there's so much in that last clip that I loved. One of the things that stood out to me was that John refers to Mary, the mother of Jesus, as mother, and she refers to John as son. Here we have an obvious allusion to a tradition that is rooted in the Gospel of John, chapter 19. John 19, if we go to the slides here, we read that when Jesus was on the cross, he saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, and he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." And then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her to his own home. And so here we see Jesus identifying one of his disciples as Mary's son, and Mary as the mother of this disciple. And this is being taken up in the Chosen because the Chosen producers have decided to follow here the tradition that disciple who was at the cross was none other than John, the apostle, the son of Zebedee.
Yeah. So that's a really beautiful portrayal. And to see, this kind of familiar, intimate relationship in a way that they have is really lovely. And it's a very Catholic way of presenting things. And one of the points that Mary makes in this scene, she alludes to Big James's death, right? And so why is he doing this now? Well, he doesn't know how long any of them will be around. He wants to start collecting testimonies and details now. But then Mary says, Matthew is doing this too, right? And so we have a little explanation of why John is doing it, even though Matthew is going about this. And this will touch on our point about the compilation of the Gospels too. So let's take a look at that clip.
Isn't Matthew going to write something?
He's only writing about what he saw and about what Jesus told him directly. But I was there for things that Matthew doesn't know about. I was in his inmost circle. He loved me.
He loved all of you. You just feel the need to talk about it more often. I prefer to treasure these things in my heart.
So another neat scene here. What I liked about this, one thing that I liked about this was that John explains, well, Matthew's writing his own account based on things Jesus told him and things that he saw directly. I'm going to write based on other things that I saw that he didn't witness. And then he refers to the fact that he was in Jesus's inner circle. And in fact, that's the way the Synoptic Gospels often present it. Although it is interesting that it's in the Synoptic Gospels that John is always emphasized as in Jesus's inner circle. You would expect that to be something Matthew would want to stress. Anyway, but we see examples of this. For example, if we go back to the slides, guys, we see that Peter, James, and John were there at the raising of Jairus' daughter. And it's depicted beautifully in The Chosen, where Jairus' daughter is dead, of course, and only these three are allowed to go into the room with Jesus. Likewise, at the Transfiguration, we haven't seen that depicted in The Chosen yet, so that'll be interesting to see how they show it. But I expect that we'll see that Peter, James, and John are alone with Jesus, as they are in the gospel narratives in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And then, of course, when Jesus is about to celebrate his Last Supper, he tells the disciples that they need to go and meet a man, and then they'll see the place. The owner of this place will show them where the Last Supper is to be celebrated. And what's going on there is Jesus knows he's about to be betrayed. And so there's a little bit of cloak and dagger stuff going on there where Jesus already made preparations. Peter and John are the two that Luke tells us were sent by Jesus. And then finally, in the Garden of Gethsemane, we have Peter, James, and John being taken aside by Jesus before his passion as he begins to pray. So John really is in that inner circle throughout the narratives. And then there are other things John says. For example, I'm not going to include a genealogy. Matthew's already going to cover that. And famously, of course, that is how Matthew begins his gospel. So I thought that was neat, the way they wanted to emphasize the way the evangelists have their different interests and how that explains the differences in the Gospels.
Yeah, and it's neat too. One of the points there is Mary talks to John about the genealogy. Where's John going to sort of start his gospel? And he says the beginning, and there's a reference to the genealogy. He's like, well, Matthew's doing that. And as we've seen the portrayal of Matthew in The Chosen, you can kind of imagine, that would be Matthew's thing, right? The genealogy.
Right, yes.
And so he wants to go back still further. So again, you see this kind of diverging perspectives, not as though they're not complementary, but I want to bring something else out. And one of the things I loved about this scene, and we're spending quite a bit of time just on this opening scene because I think we liked a lot about it. But one of my favorite parts is in this dialogue between John and Mary. Not only is it a familiar, loving dialogue, but you see that Mary plays actually a kind of important background role in the composition of John's gospel. Now, we don't know how historical this is, but the analog in my mind is if we look at the opening of St. Luke's gospel, a lot of this with the infancy narrative there, there's a strong tradition of thought and scholarship that sees Mary as being a source of this because she would really have only been the only one, right, to know about the Annunciation, for example. And so you have in a more kind of pronounced way in Luke's gospel this role that Mary plays as a source of the gospel. And as a woman of prayer, this is so fitting. But I like here how it's the suggestion is, if it's true that John took Mary into his own home, and if they were contemplating the mystery of Christ together and talking about it, of course she would have had a formative role in that. And so, Mary giving John some suggestions here and helping him think through, well, how far into the beginning are you going to go, is actually a really enriching way, I think, about an enriching way of thinking about how the Gospels were composed, and in particular, St. John's Gospel.
Right. And I think what really stands out to me, Scott, is the fact that in the depiction of The Chosen, Mary is there not just as a kind of institution. She's not just a person that is to be respected because of her, in a sense, in her office, right? She is the mother of the Messiah. But even more, she has a real relationship with the apostles. And you get that sense both from John 19, also in the book of Acts, where we read that the disciples are gathered together in the upper room, and we see that the Blessed Mother was there as well. So we see lots of evidence that the disciples would have had this relationship. Now, why is it that we think that John is the beloved disciple? Where does that come from? Well, let's take a look at this. In John 21, if we go to the slides here, we read, at the end of the gospel, Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them, the one who had leaned back against Jesus during the supper. And so here we have a disciple who's described as the disciple whom Jesus loved. And of course, in The Chosen, Mary is depicted as alluding to this, right? Well, you like to talk about your special relationship with Jesus quite a bit. And so we see this in John 21, this idea that Jesus did have a disciple who he had a special relationship with. And in the tradition, this is understood to be John. We'll talk about this in some other episodes as well. But in the Gospel of John, it seems like that disciple whom he loved would have to be one of the people who were especially close to him. So Peter, James, and John. And it can't be Peter for obvious reasons. We just mentioned that. So it does seem to get narrowed down to John, and at the end of the gospel, we read that this is the disciple that wrote things down. So the tradition. Now, one of the things that I just love is in The Chosen, Mary does say, well, you like to talk about his love. He loved all of you. You like to talk about this a lot. And that's a really interesting nod to the tradition about John the Apostle that we find in early church sources. One of my favorite stories about the Apostle John is related in Jerome's writings. Jerome tells us that, and we can go to the slide here. Jerome says, "Blessed John the Evangelist, when he was staying in Ephesus until extreme old age, used to be carried to church with difficulty by the hands of the disciples." So I love this. The disciples have such affection for him. They want to make sure he's present. They would bring him out to the church. He was not able to put many words together with his voice. He was elderly, so he couldn't say much. And he was accustomed to utter nothing but this during every gathering: little children, love one another. So here we have a tradition that John was associated with this importance of love. And we see that, of course, emerging out of the epistles of John that are also traditionally attributed to John the Apostle. And then, of course, Mary in the scene says, well, I prefer to treasure these things in my heart. And that is an allusion to a tradition we find in the Gospel of Luke. In Luke chapter 2, we read, and Jesus, we can go back to the slides here. Jesus went down with them when he was young, and he came to Nazareth, and he was submissive to Mary and Joseph, and his mother treasured up all these things in her heart. Now, people have asked, how would Luke know what Mary's internal reflection on the life of Christ looked like unless she had somehow been interviewed by Luke? And so Luke says he spoke to those who were eyewitnesses from the beginning. Well, who would that include? It would have to include Mary. And of course, we see that she's present in the upper room in the book of Acts. So this is where The Chosen is getting some of these ideas.
Yeah. I mean, one other part in this scene that we really liked was the depiction of little James giving his testimony. So we've got that in a clip as well. Let's take a look.
I'm sorry. All of this is just, it's difficult to talk about. Yeah, it reminds me of how much I miss him.
But we have to.
I know. I talk about him to others every day. But it's difficult with all of you. It's different with all of you.
So how much I miss him, and there's a neat distinction too between, he says, I talk about him all the time.
I really like that
yeah,
too.
He's sharing the gospel, but it is really true that there's a different mode that you would do something like that compared to talking to your closest friends, and the poignancy of having been in Jesus's presence. And so what this scene reminded me of, it's very easy for me at least to kind of forget that the incarnation and Jesus becoming man, it wasn't sort of this purely functional, transactional thing. Like God's like, well, there's a problem of sin. I'm going to just save it and save humans by sort of like sending my son. He goes straight to the cross, takes care of that, right? Rises from the dead. The early church fathers have this kind of appreciation of one of the things that Jesus did in coming among us and becoming man in the flesh was sort of, you could almost say, simply to spend time with us. Why? Because, first of all, God could have, so to speak, snapped his fingers and saved us. That's within God's power. But instead, he became one of us, not only to atone for sin, the early church fathers point out, like Irenaeus and Athanasius, but also to be with us and to be friends with us. For example, Athanasius asks, sort of raises the question, well, why didn't Jesus sort of become man and then die kind of immediately or quickly? Like, why draw this out, And his answer basically moves in the direction of saying, among other things, he wanted to spend time with them. He wanted to be friends with them. And friends need to spend time in each other's presence, in the company of the other. And so it's sometimes easy for me to lose sight of that. And so to see this portrayal of little James here, just saying, boy, I just miss being with him. It's such a human reaction.
He gets a little emotional.
He gets a little emotional. And the other side of that too is Jesus didn't choose each one of these apostles sort of as individuals. Like, I'm going to have this relationship with you, then I'm going to have this other relationship with you, and then with you. But what he did was he loved them in a way and taught them to love so that they could form a community together. So it's not a kind of individualistic, just me and Jesus.
One-on-one.
Right. I mean, it is that. Each of them certainly has a profound, intimate relationship with Jesus, and that's why they need to be interviewed to see, the ins and outs of that. But they also form, a band of brothers and sisters. And again, this comes through in little James. Like, it's just different when I talk with all of you. Like, you're my closest friends, basically. So I really appreciated this this little moment of little James's kind of testimony to John as he's recording these words and these sources.
And we really see how that friendship with the disciples involves the communal dimension, also the individual dimension. That's really brought out in the episode in reference to Jesus's relationship with John and the way the Apostle John is now thinking about writing the prologue. John is sitting there. He can't figure out, how am I going to begin this thing? And he's trying to figure out what would be the best way to start. And what we end up doing is we get an insight into how he ended up coming upon starting with an allusion to creation. And it takes us back into an episode of Jesus' ministry according to the chosen, right?
Right. And so this scene kind of, there's a scene very near the end of this episode where Jesus and John are talking through the selection of a scroll to be read at synagogue there in Samaria. And it's sort of, we've been waiting until the end here to kind of maybe see the most direct connection to this opening scene of John composing his gospel. And so as they're picking it out, and Jesus asks John his favorite passage, and they have a neat way of kind of spinning this out in the Chosen. We've got that in the clip, so let's take a look at that.
I suppose I love the beginning. I love how God simply spoke and the world came into being.
Yes. As David wrote, by the word of the Lord,
The heavens were made. The Greeks use word to describe divine reason, what gives the world form and meaning.
I like that. And it is a favorite memory.
Okay, so there are a lot of cool things here. I just have to say, I do have some misgivings about the way this is being presented. Jesus is invited into a Samaritan synagogue, and he's asked to read the scriptures. We have to remember, it's not just that, Samaritans and Jews basically had the same Bible. The Samaritans had a shorter version of it. They actually have their own version of the Pentateuch with some pretty important edits, right? So whether or not Jesus himself would have endorsed these scriptures by going in and reading them is a question that I have about all of this. That set aside the historical questions. I love what Jesus says here when he refers to creation as a favorite memory.
And in a kind of offhanded way, you know, so
Right.
not drawing attention, but just like, and it's a favorite memory. You know?
Right.
And it ties into, we talked about this higher Christology, right? This
Right.
transcendence of Jesus, where sure, he's down to earth and he's sort of actually approaching John. This is after he's kind of rebuked John and called them sons of thunder because they're kind of overly zealous. And so as a way of kind of picking him back up after this rebuke, he invites him to come back and help choose this passage. So, you know, there's a very human and kind of gentle dimension here, but at the same time, it's so nicely balanced with, let's not forget that Jesus is the Lord, right?
Right.
He is the Logos through whom God created the whole world, and that's why it's a favorite memory.
Right. And I do appreciate that in the episode, John points out that the Greeks use the word logos, the Greek word for word, right, as a reference to divine reason, that which he says gives the world form and meaning. And so we actually do have historical parallels with other Jews who were thinking about how to apply Greek thought to the interpretation of the scriptures. We have a Alexandrian writer from Egypt, a Jew named Philo, who actually uses the word logos, and he speaks of the logos as the angel of the Lord, you know, the messenger of the Lord. If you go back and you read the story of the burning bush, right, it's unclear who's speaking from the burning bush. Sometimes it says it's the Lord. Sometimes it seems to indicate it's an angel who's speaking. Some church fathers like Justin Martyr really like to exploit that and said, well, the angel messenger is the one who's sent, and that's Jesus. So here we have a sense of the Trinity already hidden, if you will, in the Old Testament. Of course, Philo, which is kind of interesting, refers to the Logos as a second God, which is sort of strange for a Jew to say, you know, they believe that there's one Lord. So you see in the Gospel of John, all these things coming together. And in the prologue, what do we read? Let's take a look at the first few verses here. In the beginning was the Word. And of course, that's a reference to Jesus. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So here we have the idea that there is one Lord, there is one God, the God of the Shema, but there is a kind of plurality in this one God. Later, church councils will use the word person, but that's a word that Christians had to kind of invent, right, to make sense of the biblical data. There's a mystery here we're trying to capture, and we want the mystery to stand. How is there three and also one, right? He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. Here we have, as you said earlier, very high Christology. Of course, there's also low Christology. Jesus dies, he's a man. There's high and low Christology in the Gospels. What's really striking here is the beginning. In the beginning, which is an allusion to Genesis chapter 1. And so the Chosen is showing us that John wanted to go all the way back and highlight this high Christology that Jesus sort of intimates to him standing there in the synagogue. Creation, it's a favorite memory.
Yeah, and you know, to take it back to the whole composition of the Gospels point, which I just think this episode does such a nice job of bringing that out. Matthew's genealogy, the beginning of Matthew's Gospel, traces back to Abraham, right, to show that Jesus is in the line of the patriarchs.
And also to highlight that he is the son of Abraham, Isaac, right? He's the new Isaac, who's like the son of Abraham, sacrificed and offered, although, of course, he's delivered from being under the sentence of death after 3 days. God restores him. But yeah, there's the Isaac imagery there and going all the way back to Abraham.
Yeah, and then Luke goes even further back in his genealogy to connect Jesus as a new Adam. So he goes back to Adam.
Yes,
right?
yes.
And then John continues this game of one-upmanship, right, to go back to Genesis 1. And
Right.
that there is no beginning beyond that, right?
That's
so,
right.
You have this neat way of seeing that this approach that John opts for is unique amongst the Gospels and just fits into, it's one of three ways that the Gospels sort of trace the origins of Jesus. And in John's Gospel, that phrase, where is Jesus from? Where are you from? This Greek word ek is very important, and John is basically saying ultimately he's from God, right? And so that is again upholding the divinity of Christ.
There are some other instances in this episode, though, where we also, not just in Jesus' relationship to creation, but there are some other episodes or some other dimensions of the episode that really highlight Jesus' divine identity. You were pointing out one of them when we were talking about this episode.
Yeah, there's an episode where Rema and her father come to talk to Jesus. This was the one, I think, right? And there were a couple of things that stand out. One of the things was I thought that this gave a really beautiful portrayal of some hard words in the gospel, right? Where the idea that's expressed is, whoever loves father, mother, sister, brother more than me cannot be my disciple. And sometimes you feel like, well, is this like a competition between Jesus and my family? I mean, that's pretty tough, right? And the way it gets portrayed here is you see Rama's father coming to talk to Jesus to thank him, first of all, but then he cares for his daughter so much that to sort of follow an itinerant preacher, this is very hard for him. He can't support that, but he's going to let her do it, even though it's so hard for him. And you see the love he has for her. You see the love she has for him, but she has to choose to follow Christ even above that. And it doesn't mean that she hates her father in the sense of like they just don't get along anymore, although that can happen, of course. But here you see that there is just a tension sometimes between discipleship and ranking Jesus really first and the natural and good love that we have for parents, right? But then also there's a way that this shows the kind of transcendence of Christ as well. I think you were helping me to see this point.
Oh, well, I mean, I just think it's a fact. Jesus says in the Gospel of Matthew, we go to the slide here, whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Well, that's a pretty shocking statement for an ancient Jew, because the only person that you would love more than your father and mother is God himself. All right, so if you think of the Ten Commandments, there are 2 tablets, and the first 3 of the Ten Commandments deal with God, and then the second tablet deals with your relationship to other human beings. The first one is honor your father and mother. So in this particular expression, Jesus is pointing the way to his own divinity. That's something that gets overlooked a lot of times, because Jesus doesn't go walking around, especially in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, saying, "Hi, I'm the Lord, the God of Israel. Nice to meet you." Instead, he speaks in a very Jewish way, kind of parabolic, cryptic ways that provoke you to thought, that stimulate thought and cause you to wonder, wait, as we read in the Gospel of Mark, what kind of man is this?
Yeah.
Right?
So we've been appreciating these moments where Christ's divinity peeks through. And another scene that we really liked where this happened is the scene where Jesus is talking with Melech, this crippled man.
Oh, yeah.
And it's a beautiful scene. Let's take a look at that clip.
Every day, I think about that Jew. Naked and alone, on the road, possibly dead. I could be a murderer. He didn't die. Somebody came along and helped him. How do you know? Melech. I know. I promise you, he did not die.
So here Jesus shows again that divine knowledge that he has. He says with utter confidence and authority, I know, right, that Jewish man did not die. Now, again, here there are some fascinating allusions to the parable of the Good Samaritan. It's really interesting that the way they've presented it, the man who attacks the Jew is a Samaritan, right? And then the man who is the good neighbor, in a way, who comes to the help of this man who's been attacked, the Jewish man who's been attacked, is also a Samaritan. There's some interesting things there. We probably don't have time to go into it, but fascinating portrayal there. So this divine knowledge. And related to that, I just want to, the character of Melech here is really fascinating, and it runs through this episode kind of under the rubric again of the Good Samaritan parable, also the lost sheep, which this story Jesus tells in one of the scenes where he's preaching. And I was reflecting on this character just a little bit, and the name Melech. Why? Because sometimes when they make up these characters, you wonder, why did they choose the name? And the name Melech, it means king in Hebrew, but this man is not obviously a king. And so I was trying to think, well, what's going on here? And then I think what they're doing, and this is really beautiful and fascinating, is Melech in the Old Testament is the grandson of Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth is a cripple who's brought into King David's court, restored the inheritance that is rightly his because he's in the line of Saul, and is sort of elevated in this way. And I think by naming this character Melech, it's a way of showing that he's also, so to speak, in the line of Mephibosheth. He's crippled, he's healed and brought into the presence of Jesus and restored to his fortunes through the hard work of James and John plowing his field, but especially through his encounter with Christ. And so that's a really neat narrative arc that I think they're trying to go for there. But once again, to see Jesus in his divine knowledge that goes beyond the kind of circumstances immediate to them is kind of a neat thing to see.
100%. And we also see Jesus say in this episode, he says, I am who I am, which is, of course, something Jesus says essentially in the Gospel of John chapter 8, where Jesus says, Amen, amen, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. And we talk about this in other episodes, but in Greek, the phrase there, I am, is ego eimi, which is, as many scholars have pointed out, this is the expression that's used, it's associated with the name of God. It's used in connection with the burning bush, where God says, I am who I am. It's also used in Isaiah. So we see this idea that Jesus is the Lord, the God of Israel, which is truly earth-shattering. And it's something that gets muted a lot in The Chosen, at least from my perspective. So I want to celebrate when we do see that there.
I think sometimes the worry is if we show his divinity, it will sort of crowd out his humanity. But we thought that in this episode, they actually do a great job of still incorporating the humanity of Christ.
Right.
We've got one last clip with Jesus, and he talks about taking the room.
So they're being brought into a room to spend the night, and the owner of the house tells them, one of the rooms is haunted by my dead grandmother.
And Jesus has a great reaction. So let's take a look at that clip if we can.
Come in.
Shall we? All right.
One of the rooms is haunted by my dead grandmother.
Oh, I'll take that one.
Do you know who he is? He's not afraid of ghosts.
I might be.
So that little bit of humor, I think, just captures in a way, ooh, I'll take that one. The look on his face and everything captures the humanity of Christ in a very...
And I like the way they're setting up later the scene of Jesus walking on the water, because Andrew says, well, I might be afraid of ghosts. Yeah. And we actually see that he is later on in the show.
Yeah, so lots to think about, to ponder, lots that we appreciated in this episode, other questions that, we want to keep reflecting on. But we hope you enjoyed this commentary. We hope that it sends all of us back to God's Word to reflect on what He has revealed to us about Himself. Until next time, take care and God bless.